Hello, everyone. For First Chapter Friday, our selection comes from Flying Lessons and Other Stories. It's an anthology edited by Ellen O. And the selection comes from The Difficult Path by Grace Lin. When I was sold to the Lee family, my mother let Mrs. Lee take me only after she'd promised that I would be taught to read. Her mother had 14 other children starving and clinging to her, yet she was still insisting that I promise. Mrs. Lee sniffed and began a high-pitched imitation. Promise me that when she's 6, you'll have her taught to read. On your ancestor's grave. Promise. You didn't have to agree, Auntie Wang replied peevishly. This was a story she had already heard many times. A girl learn to read? What a waste! Mrs. Lee continued, her annoyance at the past greater than Auntie Wang's with the present, just because the mother had been a scholar's daughter. Then you shouldn't have lied, Auntie Wang said, rolling her eyes. She helped herself to some honeyed lychees I held. I thought she would never know, Mrs. Lee said. I just said yes so that I could take the baby and go. I made a soft coughing noise and placed the tray on the table. Mrs. Lee, I said, as I bowed low, teacher is here. She snorted with irritation and waved her arm, her voluminous silk sleeve flapping like a flag of surrender. Go, she dismissed me. I hid my smile and tried to walk humbly, as all the browbeaten servants were supposed to do. Unlike Auntie Wang, however, I was not tired of Mrs. Lee's complaining story. I had no memory of my mother, but hearing how she had dared to make demands of the formidable Mrs. Lee on my behalf always made me feel a sense of pride. Despite my mother's poor circumstances, she must have been spirited. And perhaps it was my mother's spirit that forced Mrs. Lee to keep her promise. For on the day I turned 6, a new tutor came to the house of Lee. As I cringed during my daily duty of emptying the chamber pots, I saw the top of his black scholar's hat glide slowly past the family shrine into the schoolroom. He had come for Mrs. Lee's repulsive only son, Fu Ding, of course. The learned scholar was yet another tutor, hired in hopes that Fu Ding could be taught something. The last 2 teachers had departed in disgrace as well as anger. For because Fu Ding remained unable to read a single poem, Mrs. Lee had also refused the tutor's pay. My birthday and a new tutor's entry should have been of small consequence to the house of Lee, except it was also on the day that the incense of the ancestral shrine refused to light. Master Lee tried again and again, but no matter how large a flame he held, the incense would not burn. In desperation, Master Lee turned to the new tutor for answers. It is apparent, the scholar said, that you or someone in your household has shamed your ancestors. Perhaps someone has stolen something or has broken a promise. Of course. Master Lee nodded with respect. Then he snapped at Mrs. Lee. Wife, we have angered our ancestors. What have you done? The house of Lee roared into a typhoon as all, from the head cook to the lowliest servant, me, were questioned. When it was discovered that it was my 6th birthday, Mrs. Lee remembered her promise to my mother, then paled and swayed like a blanched stalk of bamboo. It couldn't be, she said in horror. But it could be and probably was, the new tutor said, and immediately quoted his price for 2 students. Mrs. Lee, still aghast at the revelation and fending off insults from her husband, did not even haggle over the price. She did try later, claiming that as a girl I should be cheaper, but he responded that because I was a girl, he should be paid more, as he was making an exception. So the matter was dropped, and I began my education. That was over 6 years ago. It was also over 6 years ago that I saw my teacher walk in with a new pair of shoes. Those shoes glided on the smooth stone floor, only hesitating as he paused in front of the shrine. With a sharp glance around, he quickly changed the incense, ensuring my lessons and his larger salary. "You are late, Ling-Si," teacher said, but without anger. He knew Mrs. Li was always the reason for my tardiness. "Ling-Si is late," Fu Ding sneered. I tried to consider Fu Ding with kindness, for it was his inability to read little more than his name that had granted me so many years of lessons. But it was difficult. His body had over the years grown into a man's, but he was still the same lazy, spoiled brat he had been as a boy. If anything, the years had made him even more horrible, for now he had a vicious streak that delighted in cruelty. I couldn't help shivering when I saw that he was pulling the legs off crickets again. "Today's poem," teacher said, ignoring Fu Ding, "is The Difficult Path by Li Po." I knelt at the table and began to read. "I will ride the winds and surmount endless waves, setting sail on the vast ocean. I will one day reach the distant shores." "The ocean," I murmured. I had been outside the walled estate of the House of Li only a handful of times. However, one time Shu Wan, the head cook, and I had been sent to town to buy pepper, and I had caught a glimpse of the sea. But only a glimpse, for when I tried to see more, I was yanked away. Shu Wan had a terror of pirates, and was convinced that just looking at the sea could make them appear. "Li Po writes of endless hardships," teacher said, "but you also feel his valiant spirit. I hope this is something you remember, Ling-Si." I looked up at him, the question in my eyes, since I dared not ask with my voice. "Today is our last lesson," teacher said. "Mrs. Li has informed me that Fu Ding will soon be of marrying age, and his time must now be spent in other ways." We both glanced at Fu Ding, who was creating a pile of dead insects, and then quickly looked away. My eyes filled with tears. I had known that these lessons would not continue forever, but now that they were ending, I felt I could not bear it. "You have learned much, Ling-Si," teacher said to me kindly. "You are a very smart and clever pupil. If you had been a boy, I have no doubt you would have won honors at the imperial examination." I tried to smile, but could only bow my head. I felt teacher's hand gently rest upon it. "Mencius, the second sage, said that there are 3 joys in this world," he said: "health, a clear conscience, and teaching those who are worthy. Teaching you has been a joy, Ling-Si." My tears continued to drop long after our last lesson, long after teacher had left the House of Li, and I had swept up Fu Ding's collection of insects. They even continued as I scrubbed the pots in the kitchen, much to the annoyance of the other servants. "Stop your crying," BC snapped, carrying over dirty bowls for me to wash. "We've got enough to do without listening to your sniffling." "Look at me," Shu Wan said. "I have to prepare lunch boxes for the entire household. And am I wailing? And Haobo and Mu Gang and all the men have to prepare the sedan chairs and get ready to carry fat Fu Ding for hours tomorrow, and they aren't crying either. So your sniveling is not welcome." I gulped and rubbed my face with my sleeve. "Why are we getting lunch boxes and sedan chairs ready?" I asked. "Where is the family going?" "Where are we all going, you mean?" BC said. They're taking all of us this time, even you. Me? I asked, surprised. I had assumed that Mrs. Lee and the family were going on an extravagant picnic or visiting Aunt Sue or some other rich cousin's mansion. Where? Why? It's the first of the month, stupid, BC said. You may have gotten all those fancy lessons and learned to read, but you're still not very smart. They are taking us to the temple service, of course. But the temple of longevity is not ours, I began. We're not going to the temple of longevity, BC said with exasperation, but I could see that her frustration was more about the inconvenience than it was for me. We're off to the Infinite Stream Temple this time. That huge gold temple by the ocean, I said. Why? For Fu Ding, of course, Shuan said. Mrs. Lee hopes she can get the abbot to be a matchmaker for him. Infinite Stream Temple. That's why it has so much money. It gets an infinite stream of bribes. She'll need an elephant's weight of gold to get a matchmaker for Fu Ding, BC grunted. No matchmaker is going to arrange a marriage with a well-born girl to that rice bucket. You'd think Mrs. Lee would know that. She does. Mrs. Lee is no fool. Why do you think... Shuan stopped, and both servants looked at me oddly. What? I asked. As the silence grew longer, I put down the teapot I was washing and glared at them. What? I demanded. Tell me. And this has been an excerpt from Flying Lessons and Other Stories.